Good afternoon, good evening. I am Scott Labar. I am chair-elect of the Solo Small Firm and General Practice Division. And on behalf of our chair, Steve Curley, who could not be here today, and our 21,000 plus members, I want to welcome you to our next installment of this Activate Diversity series that we have been maintaining now for almost 2 years, and it has been incredibly successful, and it's one of the great programs we have here at GP Solo. And for those of you who are not members of GP Solo, I would urge you to join. And if you're not a member of the American Bar Association, I would also likewise urge you to join. If you are a solo practitioner or a small firm lawyer, when you join the ABA at only $150 in dues, you automatically can choose to become a member of GP Solo and access all of our wonderful benefits. You can always go, of course, to our website, americanbar.org/Gen Practice, GEN Practice. So I think I will limit my remarks to all of that and turn it over to the experts. I will now like to introduce to all of you Kelly Adams, who is our diversity director, and she'll get us started. Kelly?
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, everyone. Welcome to our third Activate Diversity series of this year, titled Activate Diversity, the Privilege of Criticizing Critical Race Theory. We are excited that you have decided to join us today. We hope that you're equally excited to participate, ask questions. Please get engaged. My name is Kelly Adams, and I serve as the diversity director. I'd like to personally thank Scott Labar, incoming chair, also Stephen Curley and our division director, Jamie Boston, for all of your support, help, and the diversity board for helping us to put this program together. I'm not going to waste any more time. We have something exciting for you guys today. So I'd like to turn it over to Janine. Thank you.
Good evening. I am Janine Williams, a member of the Solo Small Firm and General Practice Division Diversity Board. We are so pleased and grateful that you have joined us today for another program in our Activate Diversity series. The program we've prepared for you today, The Privilege of Criticizing Critical Race Theory, stems from another number of observations. You may have seen the videos of reporters asking protesters of critical race theory, what is critical race theory? And the protesters are often giving blank stares or saying that they don't need to be able to define it to know that it is wrong. Additionally, through the media or social media, we've seen a number of policies, trainings, and decisions about critical race theory espousing themselves to be a part of that movement or part of that theory, which bear no resemblance to the true definition of critical race theory. How can we, as citizens, criticize a theory with authenticity if we do not know exactly what the theory is? Those are the questions that we have posed as a diversity board, and that is why we have brought this program here to you today. We are very fortunate and blessed to have 3 outstanding scholars to discuss what critical race theory is, its history, and its place in schools and society. I am excited to hear from them, as I know you are. So now I will turn the program over to one of those outstanding scholars, our moderator and panelist, Ms. Dana King.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. What we're going to do is we're going to begin with an introduction that traces the inspiration and the genesis behind critical race theory. So after spending many years as an attorney for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People Legal Defense Fund, Derek Bell acted as a crusader to integrate schools. Most of you probably know a little bit about Derek Bell. During that time, he began to rethink the work of the civil rights movement as it relates to the desegregation of schools. So he spent half of his career as an academic teaching law courses at Harvard University. During the 1980s, he began to rethink civil rights advocacy in general, and of course, the role that the law, whether or not there was a practical impact on racism in K-12. He specifically theorized on how central and complicit the role of law was in the construct and the maintenance of institutionalized racism. His ideas about racial progress can be found in a 1970 publication, which was used actually to teach the courses he had he taught at Harvard University. The title of the casebook is Race, Racism, and the Law. The text was used as the anchor text. And once he left Harvard, the course was no longer taught. His students, such as Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, were among many who were participating in what we call critical legal studies at that time, and interpreted the fact that the Harvard University division or department, law school did not continue Derek Bell's course, began to hold a series of conferences, protests, and discussions, which gave rise to what we now know as a movement as critical race theory. So before we have Mr. Brown and Ms. Way give us their understanding of critical race theory, we wanted to take this opportunity to thank our participants who actually answered a question, a pre-programmed question around what their thoughts was about critical race theory. So I'd like to take a moment to honor their thoughts by just mentioning, we received about 17 to 20. I'm going to read 3 of those definitions, which I thought were very, very profound. One of our participants, who's anonymous, said that critical race theory is a legal theory taught in some law schools that looks at various laws and the enforcement of those laws that treats the races differently and prefers whites over Black. Another participant said that critical race theory is the theory that racism is not just individual bias and prejudice, but embedded in our laws, policies, and institutions, such which continue to propagate racial disparities between whites and minorities. One participant simply said that it is a framework for understanding systemic racism in American society, especially as it relates to the law. So with that, we'd like to have our panelists, Ms. Way, begin with one, telling us a little bit about how she has come to know what critical race theory is and how she situates that understanding within the work that she does. And in her statement, she will highlight or at least define for us what critical race theory is. Ms. Way?
Yeah, thanks, Dana. And I think actually some of those responses were pretty spot on. I am not an attorney. I am an educator, a K-12 educator. I've been a K-12 educator for many years, and I work currently, I am back at the School District of Philadelphia. Took a little detour to India and Los Angeles and came back. So I think for my work, without really getting too deeply into relationship with K-12 as it is appearing in the current controversy in legislation being passed, which is actually, I think legislation being passed that bans critical race theory is actually a really good example of why critical race theory is needed and how the law has been used historically. And in terms of education, I think a lot of times those of us that are deeply embedded in curriculum, people talk to us about what they call hard history. And I actually always wondered about that term because to me, it isn't hard. To me, it's just history. People say, well, you need ethnic studies. And to me, that term I find funny because it's American history. And so I think what's important about critical race theory as an educator is understanding the history as a number of things, but mostly as regards to race, that it really isn't about individual people treating you badly or looking down on you. It really is about institutional and structural things that have taken place across time that have been maybe tweaked around the edges, but largely maintained. And so in order to really address those issues in the long run, students need to have a deep understanding of how those systems were created, supported, and sustained. And then we can start talking critically about like what's needed to move forward. So at least in my work as an educator, the framework of critical race theory, even before we really knew what that CRT was a thing, because it did start out as a legal, but because Derek Bell was in education, any of us who are educators and really thinking about our work deeply, we're aware of these discussions and we're bringing them into our curriculum development. So it's been a part of what I've done for as long as I can remember as an educator.
Wonderful, thank you. Mr. Brown.
I think I'll start by using a critical race theory tool, although it comes out of postmodernism and critical legal studies generally, and deconstruct myself. I'm an African-American. I was born in Jersey City, New Jersey, in a segregated housing project named for Booker T. Washington. My father was a race man and my mother was a race woman, terms that are not used so much, but people who felt that your commitment to the uplift of the African-American race was your primary objective as a contributing person going forward. I became a lawyer through a lot of twists and turns. My father was a lawyer, both criminal and civil rights. What I would do in looking at what we think of as critical race theory is first point out that it is not an ideology, it's not a religion, and it has many strains and strands. But if you view the American experience from a law and policy point of view as having three broad strands, there are those who are increasingly surfacing, having, we thought at one time, been banished to the outer limits, who say that the American experiment was an overwhelming success and we don't even have to apologize for our treatment of people of color or those who deal with intersectionality. And by the way, the current wave of criticism starts with those people, ironically. There's sort of a middle ground of people who accept that the American experiment is an exceptional one, but it has been marred by the experience of slavery, by the experience of oppression of other non-white peoples, and increasingly of intersectional folks who are not non-white. But it is correcting itself, and those problems, while important, are marginal to the exceptional American experiment. I think there is a way of describing critical race theory which says, if you take Derek Bell's convergence theory that we're going to talk about in a minute, it says, look, the American experiment started and was maintained to support white privilege. Its efforts to correct that, while meaningful, are efforts that cannot be viewed in neutral terms, but have to be viewed as having served the survival of that white privilege while not being burdened by overt racism and other things of which it is ashamed. And so our thinking about even race-neutral attempts to correct these problems has to change, and we have to be far more fundamental in our thinking. And it uses anecdotes, empirical evidence, the deconstruction ideas that come out of postmodernism to try to broaden the conversation, because ironically, although the attack right now, and I think in the case of Lonnie Guinier, came from the far right, critical race theory was an attempt to challenge the myth of colorblindness, which sees some of the civil rights movement and many liberals and neoliberals as the way forward, and to say, no, race has to remain at the center of our concern. We have to define it more carefully, understand it, and have remedies that attack the core problems of racism institutionally, as Ms. Way says, and not just tinker around the edges. So I think that's a way of describing the space that's occupied by critical race theory. In terms of my professional life, it's kind of interesting. Critical race theory, I knew Derek Bell. We weren't buddies and I wasn't one of his students, but I met him at the Inc. Fund when I came out of law school through my dad. I got to know him somewhat, and I've followed the activities of many of the crits. I think that in terms of social justice, critical race theory is a critical notion that I think has influenced many thinkers and many activists. I think in civil rights litigation, it has been a powerful way of educating students and lawyers about how we ought to think about the 14th Amendment, especially the Equal Protection Clause. I think in terms of criminal law, human rights, where I've done work in addition to civil rights, it's been less useful as a tool because it hasn't frontally attacked core assumptions in those areas, but it has done powerful work. For example, intersectionality and the treatment of women. For example, Dorothy Roberts did a lot of really interesting work about how and why Florida authorities started to prosecute women in the 80s, especially Black women who were crack addicts or addicted to drugs and gave birth to children and were then prosecuted. Kimberly Crenshaw's work in intersectionality in terms of how slow we were to come to dealing with violence against women when it was perceived as a problem involving only women of color, and how it opened up more broadly, but slightly more broadly, when it came to looking to seeming to touch the problems of women generally. And of course, there's McCleskey versus Kemp, which I think gives us some opportunity to employ some of the notions that are developed at the core of critical race theory in a criminal context. So I think it's been an interesting tool, and I'm anxious to get into the criticism because in a way, we learn as much about critical race theory by how its critics have framed it as we do by looking at its core ideas, which I think is more useful to think of than doctrines. Also, one other thing that I think is important, I find much academic writing to be turgid and unreadable, especially in the legal academy. I think some of the better writers, Derek Bell was a marvelous exception to that. I think Charles Lawrence III, I think Kimberly Crenshaw sometimes, but I think part of the challenge that has been taken on by the movement has been a challenge of making its work accessible through the use of anecdotes and through more simplified language for complex thoughts. Charles Lawrence III talked about the word, as Vincent Harding pointed. I like the word praxis. So there's been an effort as part of how critical race theory conceived itself to be instrumental and to be problem solving as well as theoretical. I want to just mention one other thing. If there's anybody here who's struggling with grasping critical race theory, partly because the writing is turgid, Derek Bell wrote a science fiction piece, and I'm biased to this because I love science fiction. It's called Space Traders. Dana and Deborah are smiling because they know this work, but it's an interesting science fiction narrative on the theory that aliens come to Earth and they offer to trade great wealth and science and technological advances for Black folks and the ensuing debate. And it's very readable. It's a way of sort of getting in on the ground floor. And by the way, if you don't want to read or have somebody who doesn't want to read, on YouTube, there's a video made by the Twilight Zone people, which depicts the events of Space Traders. And I throw that out because I think accessibility to ordinary folks who don't have time to read policy and won't read legal academic work is really important, because I think critical race theory only has meaning if it becomes accessible to and affects the lives of ordinary folks who are not scholars and are not sitting in the academy reading, which, as I said, are sometimes turgid work.
Wow.
I probably exceeded your 5-minute limit, Dana.
Oh,
Forgive
no,
me.
you were dynamite. Actually, it's interesting. Debbie, Ms. Wade come from the perspective as an educator. You come from the perspective as an attorney, and I'm actually going to come from the perspective of both, but I'm going to start from the ground up. I'm going to use my own experience as a student who was sent to schools outside of my community to integrate during the 1979. And I remember, I didn't know I would, you see, sometimes you do things and you then have to pay. So I would cut history class. And I would say to my teacher, who actually bragged about marching with King, I was disgruntled the fact that the history textbooks didn't have African Americans outside of Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, who incidentally are both my ancestors, immediate ancestors, nor did they have any much about women. And so I would cut class and then come back and during the test time and be able to perform because I was studying in the community. So when I got to college, I was fascinated with Brown versus Board of Education because I found that my experience was linked to that case. So throughout my entire undergraduate and graduate experience before law school, whenever I had to do papers, I would do my papers on Brown, the Brown decision and segregation. So I read Derek Bell. I've been reading his work since I was probably 19. So when I posed this question about how do we define critical race theory, because I eventually wound up teaching history, it was difficult for me to even use the definition I came up with. Mr. Brown, you kind of helped me rethink the definition, and how I defined it for purposes of this panel discussion is as a theoretical and intellectual movement emerging from the legal scholarship of Derek Bell, which challenged the ways in which the role of law sustains race and racial power in American society. Its methodology includes, but is not limited to, self-reflection. This is Derek Bell speaking, right? And critical thought, the placement of race at the center of intellectual inquiry, and a fearless critique of traditional liberal approach to racial justice. Now, after we spoke last week, you said something, you opened up your conversation with us, what I thought was very profound. You said, part of the criticism, which we're going to talk about, and I'm hoping you will expand on your idea, is that people don't believe that Black people have the intellect to even have a theory that would be worth leading any type of movement on the ground level. And I said, wow, he's so right, that this idea that there's a theory that has been sitting with academics, both from law school and other disciplines, because Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw will actually say, although Derek Bell is his work is the watershed moment, the other areas, the other things that we studied in college, the other disciplines, sociology, history, psychology, all have writings prior to the 1970 book that he published around race and the particular discipline. What made law so unique, it was that lawyers and law professors look at the decisions that are made, and the Constitution being at the heart of the legal or the jurisprudence in the United States, as being race neutral. So when lawyers get a case all the way to the Supreme Court, policies change, laws may change, but at the core of the so-called democracy is an instrument that the justices must use and interpret. That doesn't change. It's what comes out of that that's supposed to change. Well, then after we spoke last week, I said, wait, this is interesting, because Derek Bell is echoing Frederick Douglass when Frederick Douglass said, your Constitution is not racially neutral. It is a racist document. And so, but lawyers and judges who understand how to use the Constitution to make change is what makes the brilliance of lawyers and judges and educators and any people that would advocate on behalf of the citizens and anybody who is not considered a citizen in this country. So when I think about how I situate myself in understanding critical race theory, I have to be honest. The very first thing is, I do find trouble defending against a social construct that was not created by Black people. Black people didn't create race. So what we have is a response to what was created. And so when we get to this privilege of criticizing our response, it's like you have some nerve. So we'll start there. The second way that I situate myself in understanding critical race theory is in the work that I do. Why did I, after 30 years, decide that I would go to law school? I think from a woman's perspective, and when we talk about intersectionality, the decisions that a woman has to make, even in terms of career. So even if I'm not the poor woman, Black, Native American, Chinese woman that has to make different decisions, even an educated woman has to decide what is best for her family. So when I did go to undergraduate and I studied history, I intended to go to law school at 22. I didn't make it until I got to 50 because I had a family. And it's a decision that men don't often have to think about. But being inside one of the largest school districts and one of the oldest districts in the country, and I saw that it was very difficult to make change within. So there's an African parable where, I'm going to conclude with this. There's an elder, and then there's a young man. Children are in a river drowning. So they're both trying to get the children out of the river. The elder stops and he begins to walk away. So the young man says to the elder, "Where are you going?" The young man says to the elder, "Where are you going?" And the elder says, "Rescue as many children as you can. I'm going to see who's throwing them in the river." So I made it the remainder of my years on this earth to look at education, policy, and law. And I'll stop there.
So Dana, let me just make a couple of points here. One is, all summer long, I didn't make this, I'm not selling them, so don't call me about it, but I'm going to wear this to all the cookouts that are going to take place this summer that I'll be invited to, hopefully, where I can aggravate as many people as possible. And I think it's important to talk about how we situate ourselves, to talk about the critique, because I think something you said echoed something we discussed before. And this has a lot to do with the fine work that Ms. Way is doing, because at the core of the current critique is a fundamental attack on us. By this, I mean people of color, and especially people of African descent, as thinking beings capable of contributing to society's discourse. I think it's so ironic, because Derek Bell was really talking to the vast middle part of the American constituency, civil rights leaders, liberals, neoliberals, about how we have to rethink our position. But the current attack, and the attack on Lonnie Guinier in the 90s, comes from the far right. There's a guy, I don't want to demonize one person, there's a guy named Christopher Russo. I'm going to read what he said on Tucker Carlson, the guy with the bow tie. He said, "The goal is to have public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory." Now, despite the t-shirt, I don't think everybody has to agree with critical race theory. But to demean an idea that has its roots in one of the main currents of Western thought, postmodernism, and is designed to be an ongoing and deep critique of a tremendously important project, which is the American experiment, but to talk about its deep flaws even into the Second Republic, by which I mean the post-Civil War Republic. And this is demeaned as an idea that should be treated as though it were anathema. The banning of books, the notion that you don't attack critical race theory as an idea that you want to undermine, but you ridicule the very idea that there's a theory that originated in the minds of African people in America and is designed to challenge some of the assumptions of this republic and to change its course, that should be demeaned rather than met on the merits, is very serious. And if you saw the confirmation hearing of Judge Ketanji Brown, and you saw an ignorant woman from Tennessee and an equally ignorant man from Harvard, but from Texas, demean her, not by questioning her jurisprudence or her credentials, but by talking about a children's book at a school on whose board she sits, and in the other case, to criticize her by misquoting a speech she made in which one phrase says, when you think about sentencing, you think about all kinds of things, sociology, other schools of thought, and critical race theory, and leapfrog that into somehow backing her into a corner. And even more importantly, that she and her handlers found it necessary to really triangulate and not come out with a robust defense of critical race theory, but through the guidance of Cory Booker, to sort of say, well, I was just talking about it, didn't really mean it. I mean, she didn't say that, and I don't mean to criticize her because she had to survive in the real world. So the notion that our thought is marginalized and that we are, it's a question of, like the Redeemers and the Bourbons after Reconstruction, of demeaning the very idea of Black thought. These are people who don't know critical race theory and don't know postmodernism from the post office, and who have no idea about negritude and the Garvey movement and the rich history of ideas that fuels our lives. And forgive me for going on, but I'm really passionate about this because I think the nature of the critique, and we'll come back hopefully, and you'll let me talk about.
I would actually want to. Thank you.
Tells us that the core idea is that we're not capable of independent thought.
Independent thought. I am going to raise this next question, and we're starting to get some responses from the audience. So when I raise this next question, I'm going to ask that you and Ms. Way take just 2 minutes to respond, and then I want to have responses from the audience. Okay, so as we try to activate diversity in the workplace and within our professional spaces, I'd like each of you to assess the validity of Derek Bell's statement. And then I'm asking our participants to weigh in on this conversation. So Derek Bell said, racial progress has occurred when it is aligned to white interests, and racism is so deeply rooted in the makeup of American society that it has been able to reassert itself after each successive wave of reform aimed at eliminating it. So Ms. Way?
Look, he's so spot on, because every time you see any kind of progress, there's always a backlash, right? Whether or not we're talking Reconstruction, whether or not we're talking, CRT's been around for a long time, but when did it become a dog whistle? And it was post-summer of 2020, with the uprisings related to what had happened to George Floyd, that had so much power because it was moving not just the Black community, it was moving whole generations, especially of young people, who started to understand the structural nature of racism within the justice system, racism within the police as an institution, and we're challenging it. And so when Derek Bell says, hey, it's at that point when push comes to shove and you're really actually going to challenge the structure itself, that's when we gotta attack, and that's when we gotta come down hard. So it's one could argue that the same thing happened with McCarthyism, because it came on the heels of a great deal of labor progress. And I think anytime there's progress that might sort of affect the structures on which some of this stuff is built, it will, it will face this kind of backlash. And I think it's really important to know that this is a constructed backlash. It's not something that does not have a lot of, well, easier to just put it in the positive. It has a lot of money backing it. It has, as Raymond said with Chris Rufo's tweet, this was well thought out and well intentioned to create, to turn CRT into a dog whistle, and then to shut down any of the progress that had been made post summer of 2020. So absolutely.
So in my 2 minutes, I'm going to summarize what I could talk about for 2 hours, which is an article, a law review article that Derek Bell wrote in 1980. It was in response to Herbert Wexler's Cardozo's speech at Harvard. And I won't go into Wexler because I have some problems with Wexler otherwise. And what Derek Bell said essentially is this: if you look at two critical moments in American jurisprudence, one is the Civil War, which, while it cost the lives of 700,000 human beings, many of them Black, including Black troops, that America's stance and the development of the wartime amendments and the Second Republic was not initially developed as a moral response to the horrors of slavery, but an attempt to preserve the Union. And it was only after Antietam that Lincoln thought that the Emancipation Proclamation and ultimately the wartime amendments could be the best tool for preserving the nation, that slavery and the end of slavery and the emancipation of Black person was the result of a convergence between the moral issue and the practical needs of preserving what had been a white supremacist operation. Remember, in 1860, the slave economy would have by itself been the 4th largest economy in the world. So the second is Brown, where Derek Bell says, look, Brown is the convergence of two things. One, there was a moral component to it, but it was a clarion call in the context of the Cold War. And he doesn't mention this in the article, but the United States government was an amicus in favor of the plaintiffs, but it attached an affidavit from the Secretary of State saying, how can we convince brown people around the world to join us against the communists if we mistreat them de jure in this republic? So he's saying, again, there's the convergence of the moral with the need to preserve the establishment that currently existed. And it's really what leads to his further development of his critique. I want to add two things, just a couple of footnotes. This is the other fruit for, I love Derek Bell, I love his work, and I certainly love this convergence theory, and I agree with it. I think there are a couple of nuances. I was 8 when Brown was handed down. And there was a gathering of activists in our apartment in the Booker T. Washington Housing Project of people who saw it not as the road to desegregating schools, but as a clarion call in the fight against white supremacy. Lincoln, if you look at the second inaugural, before the paragraph that people always read at the end about, he talks about the fact that we should endure as many lashes of whip as possible in order to set right the balance of what we've done before. So there are complexities to this, but at the end of the day, his convergence theory is right on, and it then requires you to say, we have to look at every pronouncement, not as a race neutral pronouncement, but look behind it to see what does it really mean? How do we have, Brown, a change in society, but no desegregation in schools? And in fact, Derek Bell and others moving in the direction of quality education as an alternative. So I think it is important, if you only have one document to read, even though it isn't clear to me that Derek Bell would have called himself a crit. He was the father of critical race theory. And this article in the Harvard Law Review is really paramount. And I'd like to at some point come back to Herbert Wexler. I think that's important too in the criminal law context. But I'm trying to, Deb has so much to say, I don't want to talk too much.
So before I respond, I want to see what our audience has to say. Okay. We have a few interesting comments. Very true. So Daniel Lauber, we've long underestimated the breadth of white supremacy in this nation, even as one political party has pretty overtly based its recruiting on beginning with Richard Nixon. He goes on to say, he's a sociologist, and he says he can categorically state that it takes many more generations, this rate, you can imagine, to improve public views away white supremacy. It's interesting, in the grassroots African-American community, we no longer use the term white supremacy anymore. We use white savagery, because we are not saying anybody is supreme in this. So it's very interesting. Here we have I think Shawnee Stein says, arising from the US Constitution. Got it. Okay. Very interesting. So what I would just offer to both of the comments made by my colleagues is that I'm not sure how we're defining racial progress. And so I think we have to start there, because I think one of the things that Dr. Crenshaw said is that when we always use what I consider to be the 20th century or the modern civil rights movement as a way of framing the definition of racial progress, you really, it's damaging, right? Because then it becomes the standard for anything else that comes behind that, right? Beyond that. Well, you mentioned, Mr. Brown, the first civil rights movement, which was basically the Civil War, and for Black people, that Reconstruction period, or as Rayford Logan called the nadir, where you have the so-called first 3 civil rights amendments, right? So a lot of people, some historians will include the 13th Amendment, but it is now being seen as the first civil rights amendment as opposed to the 14th, even though the 14th, of course, is near and dear to our heart. The 13th Amendment, incidentally, is probably the best amendment to address right now modern day human trafficking. So that's a whole nother conversation. So when we talk about how we define or frame racial progress, I think we need to be very careful. But I read something a little different in, you want to respond?
Yeah, I wanted to say that I want to take a step back further and challenge you and Deb in a friendly way, because I respect and love you both. I wish you'd call me Raymond instead of Mr. Brown.
Mr. Brown? Okay.
But, okay. I think that one of the interesting exercises of the critical race theory was to force us to look at the meaning of race, to admit that it's not a biological idea, that it's biologically a myth, that it's a social construct. And this is where I think the work of Lani Guinier is so important. If you think about race as melanin content or African ancestry, obviously there's an element of that. But if you also think of it as a convergence of interests, remember, she was nominated by Clinton to be Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. And she was savaged as the quota queen and as an advocate of critical race theory. All she was saying was, if you have first past the post voting and winner take all voting in a district, then the numerical minorities come up with wasted votes, and that's a bad thing. Proportional representation in the voting booth would advantage both mathematical and ethnic minorities and promote inclusion. That's an idea worth discussing in an increasingly racially and ethnically plural community. And the next point was to say, it's often true that a community of color or Black folks in a given geographical place may have more in common with other people of color, maybe even in others, than they will with others geographically next to them. And so we have to think of race as sometimes the convergence of interests. And if you look at the recent Supreme Court action in dissolving a stay in a dilution case in Alabama, where 27% of the population of Alabama is Black with potentially no representatives, that's astounding. And she's saying, so we have to adjust how we think of race. So I knew you're going to get to racial progress, and you're right. But first, we have to point out that the critics were very important in putting on the forefront. Let's talk about what race is.
Let's talk about what race is. Okay. So I read into Derek Bell's statement about we define progress when it's aligned to white interests, right?
Right.
What I recall about what I call the modern day civil rights movement is something that Stokely Carmichael or Kwame Nkrumah said. He said that Kwame Ture, he said that when he was leading SNCC and they came to a decision of really who was going to lead SNCC, because it was an interracial organization and around the issues. When it was decided that white people could join, not lead, join and assist and not lead, some of the members walked out. If you go back, let's say we do go back during the period of enslavement, and we look at the free Black population in the 1830s, you have about 225,000 free Blacks. Black men had suffrage if they owned property prior to that, right? So we know with the election of Andrew Jackson around 1828-29, when he takes office, you see the disenfranchisement of Black men who own property. But what was interesting, there's a book called Friends But Not Friendship. The Quakers, who were so-called the leading abolitionists at the time, there's documentation that when the Pennsylvania law and Quaker law were in conflict, when Pennsylvania was gradually abolishing slavery and it was against Quaker law, some of the Quakers opted out of their own religion so that they could maintain the human bondage of others. So I say this to say that I'm hopeful, but I agree with Derek Bell, but I think that we really do need to take a closer look. So now that you've added in of what race is and what that means, but what we define as racial progress, and I'll conclude with this. The desegregation of schools, and I hate it when I read integrated. It's not integrated, it's only integrated if white kids went to Black schools. Black teachers were not permitted to go into those buildings. What happened to all of those Black teachers? Today, across the nation, there is a shortage of Black teachers that trace all the way back to the Brown decision. So when we get to this K-12 conversation, this is really going to be, as Debbie says, spot on when we look at really what this means, because having people advertise the first Black woman to do this, the first Black man elected, does nothing for the majority. And we need to begin to not to look at racial progress by who is the first. We need to begin to look at what is happening in general to the collective body of people, understudy, I should say. Looking for any more comments from the audience, and then we're going to move into question 3.
Before we get to question 3, I wanted to, can I throw out another idea?
Sure.
Okay. It seems to me that one of the structural issues that seems to get the most traction on the right, on those who walk around with their t-shirts that say, I hate critical race theory, except most of them haven't read it. That sounds elitist, doesn't it? Is the notion of white privilege. It is irksome because it lies at the heart of the structure that we're talking about. That is, if you talk about slavery as an institution, it was clear who got the advantage, to the extent that poor whites who had no nickel in the economic dime had a cultural currency because they could hold themselves out as being superior to Black folks. So one of the other contributions of critical race theory is to look at the empirical evidence as well as anecdotal evidence. I mean, if you are born as a child of African ancestry or a child of color in the United States, your chances of incarceration are statistically greater. If you go back to McCleskey, your chance of being executed for the death penalty, under the death penalty, are greater. Your housing, your economic and employment opportunities, your P&L, your profit and loss statement, your net worth, all of those things are empirically determined in part by race. And there is a ceiling for most folks. Indeed, that's why the concept that we talked about in our prep sessions about the school to prison pipeline, or maybe the foster care through prison pipeline matters, because we are in a society where objectively, empirically, being a person of color puts a cap on your opportunity to move forward. And if you add intersectionality to that, for example, if you're a Black trans prisoner, what is your possibilities?
Right.
The issues of how the criminal justice system affects women and women of color. I mean, all those issues are important. And I think we can't talk about the structural issues without talking about the thing that seems to, and it bleeds into Deb's area of specialty, because if there's anything that seems to annoy those who seek to ban, the very idea that you would ban the ideas in the United States of not advocating violence, but of a social construct, is anathema. But what prompts most of that is that you would tell white kids that they have to be uncomfortable. And first of all, nobody's looking for the discomfort, but that you have to recognize that race and skin color matter. And they matter in ways they should not, but they do systemically. And that's the challenge for all Americans going forward. It ain't just our challenge. And the notion that privilege is objectively and anecdotally real and can't be wished away lies at the heart of why people say we don't teach that to little kids.
All right, so Mr. Brown, Raymond, if you want to have an opportunity.
I was going to leave if you called me Mr. Brown again.
If you want to have an opportunity to get to the rest of these questions.
I'm sorry, I'll behave. I'm sorry, I'll be good.
All right, so Won't be able to, because we're a little behind where I wanted
I'm
us.
sorry.
No
That's
worries.
all my fault.
No,
Debbie,
you're
do you forgive me? Deb, do you forgive me?
I'll get a word in at some point.
I'm
Okay.
sorry. I will be silent, Deb, until you've spoken your piece. I'll give you your 2 cents and you can give it back to me.
The next few questions permit us to dig deep into the assumptions we make about how privilege, whose privilege and how privilege is being used around this conversation. So now, are some of the examples that you mentioned earlier, but I want to just read a little bit of this, and then I'm going to do the one question, and then you guys can go for it. So this is my interpretation of some of the criticism, even of the criticism. As a part of intellectual freedom, academics who build their intellectual work from theories such as critical race theory are accustomed to criticism. They're accustomed to criticism, but from their peers. One critical race theorist and scholar defines the purposeful disregard for its meaning and origins. This is one of my favorite, is Patricia Williams. She calls it a definitional theft. Others take the position that the discourse around critical race theory has shifted the conversation from the ebony and ivory towers into the general public, and therefore makes the theory more relevant and authentic. So we're going to ask Ms. Way to go first.
Yes, I agree. I agree.
Okay.
I'll take notes.
So here's the question. Should we be offended by the fact that those who would dare to publicly criticize critical race theory are seemingly unfamiliar with its origins and its purpose? So in your answer, discuss the criticism and why we should or should not be offended.
It's an interesting question. I think the criticism obviously is really misinformed and based on, as I said earlier, dog whistling politics and not really about anything substantive. In terms of being offended, I think one of the things that, Mr. Brown, Raymond had pointed out earlier about critical race theory is the importance of making things accessible, the importance of the use of vernacular and story and whose voices are being heard. And I think that it may be one area that we are at fault with, because people are being very simplistic about how they look at it. And it's very hard to take a very, like a somewhat complex idea and simplify it, but I think it's possible. I mean, I think something like data doesn't lie, right? Like you can lie about anything, but data is data. Data shows that 10 years after Brown, like before Brown, 0 schools in the South were desegregated. 10 years after Brown, 23%. And the number goes up. And if you look at the graph, it goes like this. And then suddenly it starts going like this. And as of now, it's 23%. We're back where we started. Look at Philadelphia. Look at Philadelphia. 98% of our schools have pipes with lead in them. And think about that, right? We have children going into school buildings, 50% of which were built before World War II. In the poorest countries in the world, they prioritize children. So what explains this? And it can't just be like coincidence. When you look at who is in our public schools throughout urban America, the ones that are least funded, the ones that have something as basic infrastructurally as, gee, it would be nice to have some drinking water that doesn't have lead. You know, right now what they're doing is like shutting those pipes down, but hey, who needs drinking water? You know, like what children need that? I think there's other things that kind of like I look at in what I've seen over the past year with these attacks. For example, some of the teachers that have been fired, some of the teachers that have been put on administrative leave because these laws were passed. This is actually happening. People don't realize it because no one's talking about it. But Amy down in Florida, after George Floyd's murder, hung a Black Lives Matter flag outside her classroom. And she did it because her school's 70% Black, and she wanted her students to feel safe. She wanted them to know this is a place where you can talk. And by the way, Amy's white. And she got fired for hanging that flag outside her classroom in the Robert E. Lee High School. So I'm going to speak with a little bit of anger, but I'm also going to talk story, because this is what's happening on the ground. This is what's real. Brittany Hogan in Missouri read Ron's Big Day. It's a children's book.
Beautiful too. I love that
A
book.
beautiful children's book about an astronaut. She started getting death threats. And she resigned, one of the only Black administrators in that district. She resigned out of fear. A guy named Matthew in Tennessee has been fired for teaching a Ta-Nehisi Coates essay in his classroom. I was on a call last month with a teacher, white teacher in Long Island, who's been placed on administrative leave because she wore a Black Lives Matter at school t-shirt to school. So this is like, to me, this is really real. I'm speaking from on the ground and from what I'm seeing as someone who's deeply involved with trying to support, defend teachers around the country who are facing these attacks. Teachers in Tennessee who are being handed a script to read because they're so afraid that they will step out of line of these laws and lose their licenses, that they're going to teach by reading off of a script. Like, people need to understand what is actually happening now in the name of anti-CRT hysteria. And I just feel like if you're not outraged if you're outraged at Ron's Big Day and not outraged at 98% of our children having lead in the water pipes, then something's really wrong here. Something is really wrong. And the focus is obscene.
Yeah.
We're violating the human rights of children. We're violating just anything that would even pretend to maintain this illusion of democracy. And we're getting all worked up around some kids, maybe their feelings will get hurt, which isn't even the case. So I just wanted to bring it to this level, to the real consequences of the danger of this kind of speech that's happening right now.
So I actually do get angry. I carry a chip around on my shoulder, and I nurture it and I curate it. And it's there for anybody who suggests that my people are intellectually inferior. Now, keep in mind that to steal a trope from Dr. King, anti-intellectualism is as American as apple pie. We have never, as a country or a culture, valued the notion of ideas. But it's life and death for us. The examples that Deborah just gave are really critical, but let me give you two others. I always liked the notion, or to think about the idea, that after Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, 11 states barred the teaching of literacy to slaves. The notion that we are intellectually inferior is part of the white supremacist concept that exists in this country. And in New Jersey, there was a Department of Corrections study about 20 years ago that showed a high correlation between incarceration rates and skills of literacy. So the opportunity to compete in the intellectual sphere is critical. And anytime you send a signal that says Black folks can't compete, that's a dangerous thing, and we must be angry about it. Now, the other part of that is that there is a very life and death struggle going on with respect to the world of ideas and whether we have a place in it. And I think it's really vital that we teach young kids and other folks that it's absolutely essential that we participate and compete in that world. So I think to the extent that this whole movement, and here's one of the dynamics that I learned from the old timers. I say anytime you can drive your adversary to the point that he's destroying his own articulated values, there's important things going on. The fact that after the attempt to steal an election, the right is trying to undermine the very notion of free and fair elections by passing laws neutral on their face, but designed to disenfranchise Black voters, but also disenfranchise some white voters and demean the very idea of democracy. I read the other day the litigation in Texas over the banning of books. It's mom and apple pie stuff. It's by the NAACP and other civil society groups, but it doesn't read about a defense of critical race theory. It says, is it your most treasured amendment, the First Amendment? Will you destroy the very notion of free discourse and free exchange of ideas in order to keep Black people down? So I think it's a perverse victory when you drive the enemy to savage his own values. The problem is the values of the vote, the values of intellectual discourse are values that presumably would free us all. So it's a perverse and Pyrrhic kind of victory. But I think it shows the extent to which some will go to try to overtly maintain us in our place. We're not even talking about the battle of Crips we're fighting, about those like Professor Wexley, who are in theory our allies, who would not look at things in a race. I mean, it took 16 years to get rid of the crack cocaine disparity. I mean, that's kind of astounding. That's a race neutral provision that had race effect. The fact that it's taken us 30 years to roll back the war on drugs and to look at the consequences of the war on crime in terms of incarceration rates, that's astounding. And my only regret is that Derek Bell took Wexler on his attack on Brown when I think he should have been talking about the model penal code. I think Ketanji Brown sort of hinted at that. The model penal code and the sentencing guidelines are in theory were sold to us as ways of equalizing treatment. So a Black guy in a poor neighborhood who committed the same crime as a wealthy white guy got the same sentence. Somehow those not only neutral but ostensibly benign systems have skyrocketed our incarceration rates. And one other example, and this goes to Deb's point about getting it down to the ground level. McAuliffe lost in Virginia, at least my friends who are in the campaign say, because when faced with a question about teaching of critical race theory in the school, instead of boldly challenging the question, he went off on some siding about how parents have no role in curriculum development, which is an absurd idea and a stupid rookie sophomoric mistake for a pro. In New Jersey, where the Republican Party is kind of weak-kneed centrist, except for our last Republican governor, the gubernatorial candidate, when asked about white privilege, said he didn't know what it was. So there is a basic demeaning of discourse that comes along with this. And so I think we have every reason to be angry and every reason to challenge those who would advocate this kind of purging of us from the intellectual battlefield and from the world of ideas and from the notion that we should have education. After all, this notion filters down to our young people being outside of the economy, having to survive in the black market economy of drugs and illegal conduct because they are not permitted or encouraged to get the skills they need to survive in a complex global economy. So I think we should be angry about this. And I think we should maintain our sense of anger.
Great.
I'm sorry, Dana, I went over the limit again. But
No.
Deb inspired me. It's her
You've
fault.
been breaking the rules for a minute, but it's fine.
Deb, defend me. Come on, Deb, defend me.
You know, what's interesting is that Debbie's call to action. So she didn't just give us those examples, real life, examples for us to sort of intellectualize about it. I think if we're going to use the modern day civil rights movement as a watershed moment around critical race theory, what we do know is that civil rights attorneys, both Black and white, actually change those laws. Town, city, local, it was those local attorneys and the mobilization of Blacks and whites in the South that made the laws we're talking about. So it happened at the local level. So when you talk about these real stories, it's one thing, and I'm gonna pose the question about the K-12 because we did a poll when our participants came in. It's one thing to talk about the American Bar Association, the National Bar Association, attacking is from the national level, but it is really what we do locally. And what I hear from Debbie is that who will be the attorneys that will go into these places to assist, to ensure, to fight these cases as we are fighting the laws at the national level, right? Now, the other thing is, I'm just going to push back on Raymond's position about the intellectual inferior. I always saw that in the reverse. You don't pass laws, literacy laws, against people who you think are intellectually inferior. You don't need those laws. You only pass those laws for people you see as your intellectual equal or above. There's no need for the law if we're already inferior. So I take a different position on that it's not because we think Black folk or other people of color are inferior. One, we need to make them think that they are. So we spend time in these discourse, and then we can address, as Debbie said, the lead in the pipes. So I just give you a little bit of pushback on that. I don't believe that people think we're inferior. Now, I do believe that if we recycle back to Derek Bell's position, that there are some people, and he called them the liberals, that want to control the movement. So may not necessarily see us or Blacks leading the movement as intellectually inferior, and to ensure that they maintain their place in society, they're going to make sure that they actually are able to lead some of these movements. But that's another panel discussion.
Are you going to invite me back for that discussion?
So we do have a question from one of our, now I have to be careful because it was sent directly to me, but I do want to pose it because it says, what would the panel say to those who would argue that if we all, the Black Lives Matter t-shirts, if we wear those, what about a Dixie t-shirt or a Proud Boys t-shirt? Would we get the same response? Interesting. Great question. Great question. I think we know the answer to that one, don't we? Because I've actually seen the Proud Boys t-shirt when I'm walking through the mall.
They're already out here.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, you know, it's interesting that there's been a big discussion in the critical race theory movement about free speech and hate speech, Matsudo and others. And it's the one area where it's sort of moved into the international arena. So it's interesting, but at the end, first of all, there's a different meaning to me, but it's already been here since a child. I grew up seeing Confederate flags. Yeah. I talked to a guy I know recently who is a wonderful guy who shockingly said when he went to high school in a place you might, I'm not going to identify, he was a wonderful guy. He said they had the rebel symbol on their football helmets. They had the Confederate flag, the stars and bars. So those symbols have predominated. They've existed for time immemorial, though there was a spate of them after Plessy as the Redeemers took over and tried to reimpose the Black Code. So we've dealt with those symbols our whole lives.
Absolutely.
They don't get to hold those as kind of an equivalent.
Absolutely.
It's our need to assert something else to put it in the place. And I would say, this is not a rejoinder to what you said before, but I do say, you remember that, I've forgotten which of the early hip hop groups had the title of one of their cuts. It was Fear of a Black Planet.
Public Enemy.
Public Enemy, because my son used to play it all the time.
One.
I got it. So I think that, you know, fear is a mixture of that, but I do think that we have to, and I think that in the public space, there is every reason to challenge state-affiliated use of symbols of white supremacy and the old Confederacy. Like we have every right to challenge that in the public.
I think I would just add, you know, I don't know what's worse, going to a school that's named the Robert E. Lee School and has been named the Robert E. Lee School for decades, or a teacher wearing a Black Lives Matter t-shirt. I mean, I think what Raymond was getting at is one of those is state funded. One of those, the stones that were carved to say Robert E. Lee High School were paid for by government money.
Yep.
And one of them is an underpaid teacher who, probably can just about afford t-shirts.
But
So,
when we do intersectionality, we can actually talk about the gender issue across race, because one position is that if the teaching profession was made up of mostly men, this would not be an issue about
Yep.
pay, about the right to speak. So when we get to that question, I want to revisit that. So I'm gonna preface this with, where there's an intellectual movement, there's intellectual warfare, right? So meaning that CRT emerges out of the academy where many intellectual battles were and are fought by both Black and white scholars over the communities of the American past. And so I won't go in deeply about this, but part of what I believe is that the need to control what is taught around the lived experience of Black people in this country is also an attempt to control the memory. So I'm going to go now to this question about K-12, because our memory, there's a competing memory, and I'll tell you a story. When I wrote co-authored the African-American history curriculum, and Debbie was one of our writers, when I went back into the classroom, the school that I was at was one of the best schools in the country. I taught at one of the best schools in the country. And there weren't many women and many Black women teaching history. So when we brought the course to the schools, to the district, and it was in the school, I had 150 we call them scholars, that were waiting to be in my classroom. Two of the teachers, male teachers, they'd have been teaching, white males, they'd been teaching history for 30 years. And they said, Ms. King, I don't like the course. And I said, why do you don't like the course? He said, the kids aren't interested. I said, that's unusual. I said, I have 150 kids on the waiting list waiting to get in my class. I said, I don't believe you like the course because it competes with the narrative you've been brought up on. So unlearning what you thought you knew about Black people in a course is unnerving. And, and he said, you know what, I never thought about. So we're going to ask this question: how can we address those who are not privileged critics? So I started this out with, I believe that some of the comments from there are at least 10 critical race theorists who are named. You actually mentioned Race Matters. So, Cornel West is considered one of, outside of Derek Bell and Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, he's considered one of the most talked about critical race theorists, right? Well, when I read their criticism of the criticism, it almost sounds elitist to me, right? So it's like, okay, these people are on our peer. They don't even have the right to the privilege to criticize. So, but if we say they don't have the privilege, their voices are so loud that they are influencing policymakers and lawmakers to pass legislation that intentionally silences the discussion of race and racism in K-12 public education. Before you answer and respond, we took a poll. So we would love to see the results of that poll. Wow, okay. So those of you, we were all required to participate in this poll. So I'll do question 1 and question 2. Question 1, do you know what critical race theory is? And 81% said yes, and 19% said no. We are hoping that when we are when we are finished the discussion, that 19% can at least say, oh, I think I do have a better sense of what critical race theory is. Number 2, do you support the teaching of CRT in K-12? 76% said yes, and 24% said no. So what I am hoping that as Raymond and Debbie and I respond to that question, that your response to that question goes into the chat and we can hear from you. So Raymond, because we want to hear from everybody, we're going to start with you, our great intellect on the panel, but we know
start with Debbie because I want to hear what she has to say. She's an educator, and I do. I always do, but she's an educator, and I respect her views.
All right, Debbie.
Dana, what's the question again?
Okay.
It was a really long.
It was like, okay, so how are we? Let me just say this. You've been paying attention to the criticism, right? So the voices that are being heard are the greatest are the critics, not the defenders of critical race theory, but the critics. So how do we feel about critical race theory being a part of K-12 public education? We know that this has been your work. So tell us why it should be.
I think when you do this education project well, it helps students begin to think critically and make sense of their world. They see this stuff. Nobody was blind in the summer of 2020 with what was going down. And students were coming to school, even young students, with lots and lots of questions. And if we say, sorry, we can't talk about that. We can't process what you're feeling as educators. We can't put context in place for you to understand what you're seeing. Like, I just as a professional, it just makes me I get uncomfortable. But when we do CRT in the classroom just on an everyday basis, I always use this example with this would be a middle school lesson where we talked about the GI Bill and how GIs came home from the war in World War II. And one of the great things about the GI Bill was that it allowed people to buy homes, and it allowed people to buy homes, and it began this journey of home ownership and wealth accumulation in the United States. What is not taught is that was not open for Black people. And very, very few Black GIs were able to access that program. And does that help us start to understand the roots of things like gentrification and 100 other things that can kind of go off of that? So without adding that piece, that just a very small piece, but a critical piece that helps people to see, there were things that happened, but they didn't happen equitably. And to leave that out in the telling of history is, to me, the recipe for perpetuating rather than undoing what's been done. And then we'll be just stuck in this forever. So
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
yeah, without really allowing for this kind of uncovering, and it's not lying. It's just teaching truth.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't say that education and schooling are the same. I never had a course in Black history, but I grew up in an environment where to survive, you had to understand your roots, and it's been continuously that way throughout my life, even at elite universities. So I think if schooling is akin to indoctrination, we'll never win. If schooling is, to use Deb's phrase, the development of tools of critical analysis, then you can't stay away from, if you look at chattel slavery, understanding that that's a problem in the American experiment. I was never told in school. I remember having a civics class in the 7th grade at PS 17. They didn't tell me that in the first draft of the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson actually referenced slavery as a vile institution. Oh, he blamed it all on George III, but that's another twist. At the end of the day, education is about training people to have critical thinking. And you can't be a critical thinker in America and not understand the problems of race, ethnicity, intersectionality, the treatment of Indians, of the indigenous people who are here, as well as the various struggles. Why did the Irish engage in race riots? But what was the experience of the Irish in America? I mean, you have to talk about all of those things, especially those things that are traditionally forbidden. You have to find ways to do it, and there's no point in taking young children at a tender age and backing them into a corner. But you can't stay away from the critical issues that inform us as a nation if you have any expectation that we'll survive, especially in the larger world. I mean, now I would expect children to have some way of grasping what are the principles that are at play in Ukraine. I expect children of color to understand that. What is the notion of attacking civilians? What is the notion of tyranny? But I would expect them to be able to do that while also being critical of US policy. We've sometimes been a foremost exponent of human rights and otherwise not so much. It seems to me that critical thinking is the key. If you engage in critical thinking, all these ideas must be part of the mix. If you intend to indoctrinate children and to reinforce the notion that some kids are better than others by virtue of their race, then I suppose this idea of critical race theory is anathema.
Right, awesome. So I'm going to use my response to point out two interesting questions and or statements. One person said for me not to use their name, so I'll say it this way. I think that I'm not sure if this is a question around the title of the discussion, which is why are we saying it's a privilege to criticize CRT? I think that the intent of the title was whether or not people were using a certain racial and class privilege to criticize CRT. Also, as we pointed out, and I think earlier, was that is it really a criticism of CRT or another way of using racial bias to critique a movement that was founded and articulated mostly by people of color, right? So Blacks, and then people are talking about it. But one of the reasons why we opened up with the different definitions or articulations of critical race theory is because we wanted to sort of demystify it. And I think that this next participant's statement is very important. This person said simply, 76% of people in US cannot ID the 3 parts of the US government. Now I'm gonna this is very interesting whenever I see polls, because I gotta tell you, if you were to ask anybody from my community whether or not they were ever polled, they would say no. So when people say that a certain percentage of Americans said this or that, I always ask Black people I know, were you a part of the poll? So sometimes we're even left out of the survey. So few can read well. It depends on what you mean by theory. I agree. If you are saying, should Professor Bell and Crenshaw's work be taught? Obviously not. Right, it's too heavy. That's an academic conversation, absolutely. But if you're talking about teaching the GI Bill and 10th grade, sure. So I will respond to the question I posed to my fellow panelists by saying, this is where I do agree about how we have to qualify what we mean, what should be taught in K-12, right? So first of all, the language of the legislation sounds so ridiculous that it's actually having a chilling effect on all of curriculum that would be meaningful to get students to be, and teachers to be critical thinkers, right? To use critical inquiry. And when you have 75% of the teaching population as white, teaching children of color, they need to also be able to think themselves. Like, so for example, we want the people that are standing before our children, whether they be Black or white, to be critical, right? How are you going to teach critical inquiry and you yourselves don't critically think about what is happening in this country to people of color? So we wouldn't want someone who believes that racism doesn't exist, or there's a colorblind constitution, and that law, we want our teachers to be analytical thinkers. Because guess what? Those same people we talk about, the same youth that marched and protest and sat and were killed during the civil rights movement era, who were their teachers? You have to ask that question, who were their teachers? So
I don't want to pick at the questioner, but I would say, it varies very much with the child and the curriculum that's being developed. But I don't see any reason why a kid in the 10th, if in the 10th grade, you've already had 3 or 4 years of civics instruction, if you can learn the various sections of government, you can understand how government played a role in the slave trade. You can learn about the Fugitive Slave Act. There are things. And I remember when I was 8 years old, my father, the French were defeated by the Viet Minh at Dien Bien Phu. And I remember my father saying, "You must write me a dispatch from the losing general to the French Foreign Office." And I remember my mother saying, "Ray, he's only 8 years old." It's probably why I'm crazy now. But it seems to me that depending on how you develop children's critical faculties, you can ask them to think about all kinds of questions. And again, it depends on each child, and it depends on the nature of the curriculum. What are you building? Are you building people? I say that good citizens come from people who can think about democracy and freedom in a critical way and who can embrace those concepts.
How will Black people or any other group of people solve their problems if they are not thinking critically? And so this is again, our panel is only 90 minutes. Our discussion is only 90 minutes.
Why is that? Why do we only have 90 minutes?
But so to your point, Raymond, is that students are learning about the GI Bill in World War II, but I'm going to point to a word you used when you talked about the prison pipeline. Incarceration is not just this. If we're doing this right, the concept even of race and incarceration begins to make better sense for young people. So oftentimes when people hear the term incarceration, you think you're only talking about Black people, but Japanese were incarcerated in the 1940s. Native American, indigenous societies continue to be incarcerated on what we call reservations. So when you talk about how we properly use critical race theory to translate the lived experiences of the people under study and the people that are in those seats, those classroom seats, whether they be Irish or of African descent or of Asian descent, the point is that if we are serious about diversity and democracy, then you must be able to produce critical thinkers. And the definition of learning, and this is where I agree with you, Raymond, also about the difference between education and schooling, because Mwalu Shuja made that distinction real clear. Schooling is about the rules and not breaking them. Education is when you understand that learning is about thinking, acting, more importantly, being critical and creative. And let's shift this away from the scholars for a minute. We call students scholars in my world, and talk about the teachers. It is also about learning from the people that you're teaching. So learning is about the lived experience of the students. It's not just about what's being taught in the textbooks. So learning is a two-way conversation. So
that's the whole theory, Dana, of public education, which is if we have to live in a common space, we have to learn to be critical and also find pathways forward. And just to defend, I have nothing to do with the title of this, but I think the title has some irony to it, because it is the sublime privilege to criticize a theory using your right to free speech and then ban the articulation of that theory in certain public institutions. it strikes me that that is a privileged position.
I think what's really striking to me, when I left Philly the first time, I ended up going to very privileged schools. I went from the School District of Philadelphia to the American Embassy School in New Delhi, where I was a principal, very elite private international school, to the Crossroads School in Santa Monica, California, which is one of the most elite schools in LA.
Mhm.
We're talking Hollywood elite,
Mhm.
like, hi, Katy Perry, that kind of school. And believe you me, those kids get access to critical race theory.
Absolutely.
They are learning how to think critically because they need to be able to rule the world because that's
Right,
the
right.
track that
So
they're
it has
on.
its purpose.
It's
Is that
definitely.
what Will Smith was doing in Hollywood last week?
We didn't have Will Smith's kid. Nor did we have Chris Rock's kid.
We're gonna move to that. Go ahead, Debbie, finish up. We're
Yeah,
gonna
but
move
I
to
just,
that
I
question,
feel that
intersectionality. Go ahead.
the places where this is being attacked is public institutions.
Yeah.
And that's another thing that I think is really critical, and not just K-12. We got to understand that it is publicly funded institutions of learning,
Yes.
all the way up through university, that are being attacked under these bills.
Mhm.
And whose education then, which class of people is this aimed at to keep critical thinking out of the learning process?
Awesome. Okay, so we have a call to action.
Can I add some real live thing to the call to action? If
Yes,
anyone
please.
would like to provide pro bono support for teachers and educators under attack, we desperately need it. Amy Donofrio's case was represented by the Southern Poverty Law Center, and we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of pro bono time. And as teachers around the country are facing what they're facing, folks need legal support. There is a hotline that's been developed so that educators can call in to know what their rights are. But there is a legal committee that meets once a month with the African American Policy Forum. If you're interested, contact folks at the ABA and they can get in touch with me.
Thank our participants for your great questions.
Dana, let me thank you and the folks at the ABA Center for allowing me to participate in this.
Yep. Ditto.
And I also, it was wonderful meeting Deb. And I hope we get to collaborate.
I hope we
further
talk
on
more. Yeah,
the activist part of this. Absolutely.
absolutely.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Ashley Lambert. I am a fellow with the GP Solo Diversity Division, and this has been very, very good. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I found it to be very fruitful and actually thought-provoking. I always considered, well, I thought I understood CRT, but it actually expanded my thoughts on it. And again, it was very, very, very good. I hope everyone else enjoyed just as much as I did. And yes, you all did such a great job. On behalf of the Solo Small Firm and GP Division, I thank all of our panelists, Raymond Brown, Miss Debbie Way, and Ms. Dana King, who also served as our moderator. Great job. I personally enjoyed all of you three. Again, thank you so much for all of you who decided to attend our third installment. Thank you.